Welcome to the History Slam podcast from Activehistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, where we are talking about a new movie set in the 1920s. A group of young men set out to Balsam Lake at Long Point Camp, and it is a harrowing story that emerges where these young men are encountering a freak summer storm and they are capsized in the middle of the lake. And the movie tells their story of a soul-shuddering fight for survival. A really powerful, really well put together film. And I am very excited to welcome the writer and director of the film, Richard Bell, joining us from Vancouver. Richard, welcome to the show.
Sean, thank you so much. It's a true honor. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and very excited to talk about the film, which I watched last night. It is a historical piece that is not a documentary, but based on real events. So one of the things that's interesting about this is this is an event. It happens at Balsam Lake, which is in Ontario. It's part of the Kawartha Lakes, if
Correct.
I have my geography right.
Yeah.
So sort of near Bobcage in that area, if anybody knows, sort of southern Ontario. Very cottagey right now.
Now it's cottagey, but then it was, the wild wilderness.
Right. So you're out there in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that this is a story I'd never heard of. There's a story in the Star that covered this at the time, and there was some press about it. But as a historian who has some familiarity with this era, it's not something that had come across my radar at all. So I'm curious first, how did you learn about this story, and what spoke to you about it that you immediately thought, this is a movie?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of an irony that it took a Vancouverite and a West Coast guy to unearth and expand on this Ontarian story, and you're not alone in not knowing the true story of the Brotherhood of St. Andrew. In fact, like when we did a screening in Balsam Lake for the community in July for the 93rd anniversary of the tragedy, there was a lady who came up to me who said, I have a cottage on Balsam Lake and I have lived here for 40 years and I did not know that this story happened. So, I was living in Toronto in 2006. I consider Toronto to be sort of like a second home. I've been back and forth, living off and on in Toronto, like since the 90s. And I was in a restaurant and I saw a tiny little story in a newspaper about a mass that was at St. Thomas Church in Kirkfield. That was an 80th anniversary mass of remembrance for the Brotherhood of St. Andrew, who had died in 1926. And it was a tiny story, and I read what happened about these boys setting off across the lake in a 30-foot war canoe, and the story about them, all clinging onto the canoe after being upset after the summer storm. And I was blown away by it, and I thought, wow, like that has so many elements to make such a great movie. It's a ticking time clock, right? It's a survival story. It's an adventure story, and it's a transformative story. As a writer, you always want to have, movies about create stories about characters going on a meaningful arc. And this was a transformative story in the capacity that it was about boys becoming men within the course of one evening. Foolishly, at that moment, I thought to myself, and I said to myself, wow, this would be a great movie because it all takes place in one location. So it'd be really cheap to film, and which is entirely untrue. Like anytime you're working with minors, teenagers, and you're shooting a real lake and you're chasing weather, it's millions of dollars. But at that time I thought, it's a contained story. I can do this quite easily. To be honest with you, I sort of forgot about the story and I filed it away in my brain. I was trying to get another project, actually kind of another historical true story off the ground. And, that faltered and foundered, and then it didn't happen. It didn't go to camera. So it was around 2010 or 2011 that that I picked up the story again, but I had forgotten the name of the lake, and all I remembered was that it was a war canoe, and it was boys drowning and, boys trying to survive and clinging to a canoe. And at that time, there wasn't a lot about the Brotherhood of St. Andrew on Google. So I did a bit of treasure hunting. And then as soon as I found the lake, I was able to find the stories and go to my public library here. I hired a researcher. And also now what's really great, for any history buff is that all the newspaper articles of old, they're all scanned. They're all on microfiche. And what kind of struck me about the Brotherhood of St. Andrew's story was that at the time in 1926, it was in newspapers across the world. Like it was in, the Sydney Herald, or it was in England or in the States. This story about, this band of brothers on a Canadian lake. So at that time, I was able to, using probably maybe about 25 or 30 newspaper articles, was able to lay down the skeleton of the story and figure out, what happened and the order of events.
So, yeah, there's the big Toronto Daily Star. The whole front page on July 23rd, 1926 is devoted to this Balsam Lake story and what happens here. So you're doing this research, obviously, as someone who has a background as a professional historian. I'm very curious to know not only about the process of doing the research, but between what you found and the final product as to what is on the film, like what people are going to see when they go watch this movie. How true to life is the story? One of the criticisms that often gets leveled against these based on true story events is the artistic license. And, I certainly am conscious of the fact that in any story there's going to be some artistic license taken because that's just the way it is and sort of the way it has to be. But in putting this story together, how closely did you follow the real stories of these individuals, particularly when it discusses their personal lives and the dynamics between some of the characters?
Right. So in regards to the whole artistic license thing, I have a very good screenwriting mentor who's made a career for himself in Los Angeles, and he said to me quite sagely, never let the truth get in the way of telling a good story. Now, I'm sure that that's going to be disappointing to hear to some of your listeners. However, that being said, a movie is a movie is a movie, and there is a structure to a movie, and there is a way to tell a story, and a movie is not a historical document, and a feature film is not a documentary. And I think that these days I find that people are quite savage about, oh, that didn't really happen, or that's not true. I think that a movie ought to be a springboard and a gateway to a person doing his or her own research into the world. So when I watched, The Tudors with Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, it's I didn't take that as gospel. I thought that was an entertaining, soapy TV show about King Henry VIII. Right afterwards, I went to Wikipedia or whatnot, and I did my own research, and I found out what really happened. I think the movie is the conduit to the true story. That being said, years later, because it took me a couple years to write the movie. When I went back and I looked at some of the articles and I looked at the microfiche, I was actually quite surprised by how closely I followed the real story. And also there are a lot of details about the boys and even some of the conversations that I have taken directly from the true story. So, it's kind of a little tricky to talk about because, it's also involves, quite a few spoilers.
Sure. Yeah.
But that being said,
of course.
Yeah, there's a character who says that he worked at the Wrigley chewing gum factory. That is true. There's a character who says that his father drowned. That is true. It may not be the exact character who says it in the movie. However, that is true. There's different little details about the camp or things that happened or something that was said. For me, as a writer and a researcher, I really think of myself as a treasure hunter. And when I found, little pockets of diamonds, of truth, I would take them and I would use them. And maybe things got moved around. But I'm really concerned, on a larger scale about how kind of angry and intolerant the Twitter mob is about movies that I think are pretty well intentioned, that are trying to, open up the world of a true story, and they just get told off. Like, it's a very controversial topic, but I very much enjoyed Green Book, and I felt quite sorry for the filmmakers who made that movie, for, all the resistance and the anger and the vitriol that they had to be on, the receiving end for. Even like when Roland Emmerich made the movie Stonewall, just the confusion and the anger and, about, and the kind of like, how dare you-ism of like, why would you tell this story and why didn't you tell it like this? I don't believe that people ought to tell artists how to make their art, especially when I think anybody who's making a movie is doing it with the best of intentions.
Well, you certainly hope that that's the case, right? The fear, of course, sometimes is if it feels exploitative, which is always dangerous. And I mean, I can think of a couple of examples where it's felt that way, and none of the ones that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that's interesting, too, one of my favorite lines from any movie ever is from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance at the end of the movie, where the newspaper man in the town says, when legend becomes fact, print the legend. Which I love that line so much. And it speaks to the need that people want to be entertained, right? And when they're coming to a movie, even if it is based on a true story, I think that people will come to it with the sense of there is artistic license. They know it's not a documentary. And the people who are super critical of the historical accuracy of films, I think it's often the case that I really think for a lot of them it's well intentioned as well, that they have a connection to whatever that story is and a passion for it, and that's sort of what creates this dynamic of like, oh, I just wish that this could have been told in a different way, and there's a difference between like Wonder Woman walking across no man's land in the First World War in that movie versus like Saving Private Ryan, right? And sort of the expectations that people have with those films, and that's why I think accuracy in historical films, it sort of created this cottage industry of people pointing out errors.
Of course, accuracy matters and authenticity matters. And I was very cognizant of telling an authentic story as a writer, and then as a director pulling out, all the stops when it came to authenticity, with, the actors, the production design, or the music, or the commitment to the era. All that being said, I think that as audiences and Twitter mobs get more and more angry with filmmakers, I'm just afraid that it's just going to dissuade people from touching certain things. Apple Plus just announced that they've pulled the premiere of this Samuel L. Jackson movie, The Banker, because and it's kind of like unknown as to why, but I have a feeling that there's probably like a similar situation that happened with Green Book, with people coming out of the woodwork with pitchforks about questioning the accuracy or the intentions of the movie. I don't know. I'm just guessing. However, I'm just concerned that but I mean, this is a tale as old as time. Like, there's people who, the people who read the book, who go see the movie and they say, oh, the book was better. Well, that's like comparing a painting to a sculpture. They are just completely different things. And I just don't believe that there's filmmakers out there who are going to spend 3 years of their lives and a huge amount of money to do something that's a disservice to the source material. For me, I probably would not touch a historical story that is known just for that reason. And for me, doing the story of the Brotherhood of St. Andrew was exciting because I said to myself, this is buried treasure. No one knew about it. But if it were a story that everyone knew, I probably wouldn't touch it, just for that reason that I wouldn't be able to deal with the kind of like the peanut gallery.
Right. Yeah. So within that context, though, because it's a story that, as you say, a lot of people didn't know about, myself included, there's also then a lot of holes, I would assume, in some of the research, that there's just gaps that can't be filled. And certainly in telling the story, certain devices that you need to have that there might not be a clear answer for, like, certainly the interpersonal dynamics of a group, right? That would be extraordinarily hard, even if you have all the people still alive and can interview them. It's really hard to get a sense of what those dynamics were. The conversations that take place, particularly at pivotal moments in this movie, the wording, of course, or even the sentiment that is expressed, that's hard to recreate. So what was your strategy in writing the film? Was it the way I watched it and the way I thought of it was that you're taking these people who were real people and taking whatever information you had about them and creating characters based on that. And the sense I got was that this is the people who you meet in the film are as closely representative of the information that you had as you could have gotten, because they do feel like real people.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. The only people who I really had information about would be Robert Shea Butcher, who's the camp leader. These things that are in the movie are true. He did, serve under General Currie. He did carry the Allied colors into Mons. He was, a devout leader of this Anglican camp. He did believe in the kind of old-timey ways of like the ideas of mentorship, knights and squires, boys going through, trials and tribulations. So that's true. I would say that the three male characters are really informed by my research and my appreciation of the Great War. And that their characters, like the Great War is in the very DNA of this movie. And I was less interested in what happened in the future of these characters or, interviewing their descendants than I was in looking at the decade before the movie takes place. And specifically the years 1914 to 1918. So, all the conversations that the characters have amongst each other, like there's that scene in the tent where the three leaders are talking together. They're having a private moment away from the boys and, in a way letting their guard down. It's like, well, what did the men who never talk about the war talk about amongst themselves, in private moments?
Right.
So there was that. The story and the tragedy of the Brotherhood of St. Andrew and, the series of events and them, going out on the lake and when the storm happened and all that kind of stuff, that's what happens. But as a filmmaker, as a screenwriter, as a storyteller, it's all about theme. And you look at it and you say, what is this movie about? And what is the theme? The theme is the glue, the cinematic glue that holds the whole story together. So for me, the theme was, about boyhood, about manhood, and how to make it relevant to an audience today. For me, it was really about exploring and delving into the boy crisis, the modern day boy crisis that we're living in now that, you could say maybe kind of starts in the late 1990s with the Columbine shooters, all the way up to where we are now with incel culture. Boys are, there's many, scientific papers and books about, the current boy crisis and how, boys are lost these days. They're, listless and alone, angry, apathetic, don't feel like they belong, not doing well in schools. And there's a lot of focus on, girls getting ahead and female empowerment, which is great, which is good, which is high time. And boys are suffering right now. So a similar state of concern existed in the 1920s and the 1910s about boyhood. This was the first generation. These are boys who were left fatherless by the First World War. Or their fathers came home and they were the shell of the men that they once were. It was a generation of boys who were raised by their mothers. It was the first time there were females and teachers, in schools. So people were concerned about the state of boyhood in the 1910s and 1920s, I think, as people are now. So I read a couple books. There's a great book called Real Boys, which is about the boy crisis. Also Last Child in the Woods, which is about nature deficit disorder, which is, kind of like a rallying call for children in general, just to return to nature. And also the book Iron John, which is a story about boyhood and manhood as told through myth. So all that, it was kind of like a combination of those three books that gave me the theme for the movie. And within that theme, that's how I created to get back to your earlier question, that's how I created the conversations that the boys had. I also wanted to, as an exploration of boyhood and manhood, I also wanted to create male archetypes. So you will see guys like, Waller, who's like the rebel, who in my mind was kind of like, like the River Phoenix kind of character, the rebel without a cause. There's the nerdy character like Leonard, or the awkward character like Gordon. There's the kid brother. There's the older brother. There's the jock, so I wanted boyhood and manhood in its many complicated and varied forms to be represented in the film. And that's where the conversations and that's where the dialogue came from.
So in talking about the role of masculinity in the story, I think it's interesting because, a lot of people have the idea of masculinity in a singular form of what masculinity was and maybe even is. And like you said, that there's three of these characters at the very least represent different forms of what masculinity is. And I think it's interesting to contrast it to contemporary culture and the idea of young men today trying to find their way, and a lot of times, or maybe not a lot of times, but in certain cases you have, as you referenced, young men retreating from society. How do we approach this and make it so that you can be a man and be masculine in whatever form fits you? Like masculinity isn't one thing.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a variety of things. And I think you're right. There's a struggle there for young men to feel comfortable with whatever expression of masculinity is best for them.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think it's a really hard time to be a boy right now. And I think it's a really hard time to be a man. And, I consider myself a lefty and a liberal, but wow, like I guess I'm not, in the sense that I think that the alt-left is kind of like just as frightening as the alt-right, in the sense of like speech policing and thought policing and scolding. And I don't think anybody really, I think guys today are just withdrawing because I think they don't know how to be. And the the ascension of females in our society is long overdue and really important. And, it's a fantastic thing. And there should be room for everyone. There ought to be room for everyone. And that doesn't I don't know, what does a 10-year-old boy think when he's told that the future is female? I'm not too sure what that means. And I think that, because say there's a Donald Trump in office as president of the United States, and he's kind of a perfect example of toxic masculinity, right? We don't I think that
we don't want that.
No, right. But I think that duly people are really kind of, I don't know, everyone's afraid of raising a Donald Trump or something and duly scolding boys. And I don't know, I heard a story about this, boy who got expelled from school for making the gun symbol with his hand and, going pew, pew, pew and, doing a Star Wars thing, right? It's just I don't know, if I were a mother, I wouldn't know really, or a father, I wouldn't really know how to raise boys today.
Yeah, I mean, the best I think we can do is try to teach our young men that, be respectful, right? Be polite.
Yep.
Be engaged and basically everything you see the president do the opposite of that, basically.
Yeah.
Right. But you're right. I think the one of the problems is that for 100 years in film, masculinity has been presented in one way, and that leans toward that toxic masculinity. Even more, I saw, it's silly, I know, but the YouTube channel CinemaSins, they did one about the movie Hitch, which is maybe 10 years old.
The Will Smith movie?
The Will Smith movie.
Yeah.
And the amount of stereotypes that are in that movie of men are like this, women are like this. And if you're, as I was, a young man who's been exposed to pop culture that is telling you this is what masculinity is, and this is what women are in position to that masculinity, and we're realizing that, wait, that's not real, it can be hard to navigate, for sure. And so I think stuff like this that demonstrates different ways in which young men can interact, can be comfortable within their own skin, the more sort of outlets like this film that exist, the better it is, because it gives young men of different personalities and different interests an ability to find themselves represented in pop culture.
There's many, many, many different versions and interpretations of masculinity. And for me, as a gay guy and growing up as a gay kid in a small town in a Catholic, household, for me, I just rebel against anybody's sort of version or description or rules about masculinity, or any kind of this heteronormative, this is how it should be, this is how it shouldn't be. All that being said, I have straight brothers, right? And my straight brothers are the nicest, sweetest, coolest, most kind of just well-adjusted and well-intentioned people. And I'm a little worried that right now there's kind of there feels to be a little bit of a war against straight white guys. And I also just feel as we empower other people, I don't think that we ought to be disempowering straight white guys. I really don't. I think that's problematic. I don't believe that things are as simple as finding villains and heroes, and that straight white guys are bad, or that they should shut up for a while. I think that we all need to talk. I think we all need a seat at the table to have meaningful conversation. And I don't believe in black and white. And I believe in nuance, and I believe in all the soupy gray areas of dealing with issues and dealing with identity roles and dealing with our sexuality and talking about things in a meaningful way. I don't think that this is right and this is wrong. And just because the person who's yelling the loudest doesn't mean that they're right.
But I do want to talk about the First World War in relation to the film, because the war is one of these things, too, that often gets presented in a very similar black and white way of a very simplistic narrative that gets presented, especially the idea that we hear all the time of these guys went, they died for us. And what you often see when you read some of the letters is that no, they didn't really die for us, especially in 2019. They didn't know me. They had their own motivations, and everyone had their own reasons for going to war. Some of them were altruistic, sure, and they were fighting for the nation, but others had economic reasons that they wanted to go. And it's interesting that this film is really dealing with the aftermath of those decisions and how they affected the people some who were left behind, others who went and came home and left others over in Europe. So how much of the story of the First World War and its legacy, when you initially heard of this story, did you immediately think of this connection, or
right?
Where did this sort of light bulb moment come from in the research?
Actually, the light bulb moment was I was having dinner with Bramwell Tovey, who was for many years the music director of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, and he did the score for my previous film, 18. And we were having dinner, and I was telling him the story about the Brotherhood of St. Andrew on Balsam Lake, and he was like, "Oh, what year did it take place in?" And I said 1926, and the light bulb moment, honestly, was when Bramwell said, "Oh, like, were any of the camp counselors veterans of the First World War?" And I went, wow, yes, of course, they must have been. And so that was my light bulb moment, and as I delved into the research for the film, sure enough, all three of the camp counselors were veterans. And then that kind of I just went from there. It just, the Great War hangs like a big cloud over this story and over these characters.
Yeah, and it's sort of this constant presence too. In the research, did you find that the counselors or the boys themselves, was it, because it's 8 years later, and obviously, especially for the veterans themselves, it never goes away. It's always part of their consciousness. But was it for these guys? Did you find examples of them discussing it, of it being at the forefront on a daily basis in their lives?
You mean in the research or the newspaper articles?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the newspaper articles were all about the actual event. The describing what happened, who went first, who went second, who died, who drowned. The material about the First World War was maybe, I had gotten that from say about Robert Butcher, his history and newspaper articles describing him and what led him to lead, a boys' camp. That's where I found the information about the First World War.
Okay. And in talking about I don't know if it's a spoiler or not. If it is, I'll cut it. But if the story of two of the young men, the story of their father. Actually, let's just say the story of their father.
Yeah.
Was that something that you encountered, or as part of the real story of these two men, or was that a choice that was artistic to tie in the experience to a broader national narrative?
The latter. That was an artistic choice.
Okay, and why did you feel that was important to include that particular story?
I felt like it was important because of the circumstances surrounding those characters' father's death. I thought was another take, how he died.
Yeah.
I found that was another take on the theme of war and masculinity and courage. You know, like, I watched the movie recently at a festival, and there's a line of dialogue that stood out where the older brother says to the younger brother, you know, our dad was a shopkeeper who volunteered. I think he was really brave. And for me, that's what that's about. You know, like, it's just like, maybe you didn't have to necessarily do something particularly heroic in the war. It was about showing up. It was about being there. And also, like, you know, conscription didn't come in right away in Canada. So when you think about the fact that people actually raised their hands and got in a lineup and signed up for that, I think that's, you know, quite a phenomenal thought.
Yeah, and as you see in the film, it can change people's perception of what happened too. Sort of the timeline and the idea of volunteering to do this, it does influence how we think of then and now what these guys did when they went over.
Yeah, and it's also like a whole exploration into what is a hero and what makes a hero. And there, you know, there's a line where Robert says, "A hero's just a man who's too scared to run away." And you know, this is from a person who, you know, won medals in the war. You know, it's funny because when you hear, it's not funny, it's like, it's interesting because when you hear veterans talk about the war, you know, you hear them say, "I'm not the hero. Like, the guys who died were the hero," or
Right.
"I'm not a hero. I just dodged a bullet," or "I just didn't get hit." It's fascinating to hear how they describe it.
Yeah, and each of them has their own different perceptions of it. One of my favorite things is when I was over in France, it's called Maison Blanche. It's run by a private not-for-profit group, but it's near Vimy Ridge, and it's a souterrain where a lot of the Canadian soldiers were living in the days and weeks leading up to the battle for Vimy Ridge on April the 9th in 1917, and underneath there's all these carvings on the wall because these guys were just bored out of their minds.
Right.
They were waiting, so they would carve into the wall. And one of the things they found when they were going through the souterrain was a bullet with a name on it.
Wow.
And they found in the letters this idea that for a lot of soldiers, they would take a bullet, write their own name on it, and put it in their pocket, and with the idea being that each soldier has one bullet with their name on it.
Right.
And
wow.
If I have it, then I'll be okay. Right.
Right. Wow.
This sort of beautiful thing, but again, this awareness of what they were doing, and sort of
Wow.
just having that over them the whole time, it really sort of puts into perspective the magnitude of the event.
Yeah, that's a great scene in a movie right there. You know.
Yeah, so I do want to talk a little bit about sort of the filmography of it, if that's a word, because you mentioned that this is made on location. It's made with a bunch of young men, so kids who there are rules about how long they can film and all that kind of stuff. But I'm curious as to first where the location was. Was this made on Balsam Lake?
No, Balsam Lake is far too modern now. Like, Balsam Lake is surrounded by cottages. And Balsam Lake at the time was, you know, the middle of nowhere. So we spent a lot of time searching for the right location. It had to feel right poetically and filmically. And I was less interested in getting the exact vibe of Balsam Lake, and I actually wanted the lake in the background to look a little bit bigger. I wanted it to feel like these boys were camping. They were teetering on the edge of forever. So I wanted it to be a big lake, and I wanted it to feel very much like they were in the middle of nowhere. So we searched all through Ontario, and I was quite interested in. We looked at Manitoulin twice, yeah, because it was quite fascinating. I love the carved rock. It looked very primordial, and I thought that kind of worked with my feelings about theme and myth. But we ended up going further, quite north, and we ended up on the Mishipicotton First Nation, which is near Wawa, and that's where we shot. It was the perfect location. It was just absolutely stunning. Like, it was so gorgeous. It was completely untouched. You could shoot in almost like a 360-degree direction, which was important for us. Also, there was just the infrastructure was there. There was a carpentry shop on the res. There was a nurse's office. There was a gathering place. We could do things on a reservation that we couldn't do in a provincial park. There was really no red tape on the First Nation because it was their sovereign land. And they also, welcomed us with open arms. And people, from the reservation worked on the film. Like, they worked in locations, they worked on props. Their public works fellow, he was fantastic. The sets were built with trees that were felled on the First Nation and that were put through the miller on the First Nation. So it was kind of like a fantastic package deal, in the sense that it was the location that I was looking for that was very mythic and colossal looking, but also had the infrastructure built in. And it just felt good. Like, the movie, like Robert Butcher, he talks about it. He says, this is old Ojibwe land, and the Mishipicotton First Nation is Ojibwe land. The chief, Pat Tangi, was fantastic, was very supportive. The first day of filming, the morning we all gathered, cast and crew, and she led us in a smudge, and for the intentions of the movie, and it was very meaningful. And I feel like that kind of meaning and that kind of sparkle, I think it comes across in the movie as well. So it was, for me, it was like the perfect location.
And it certainly looks great on film too. I'm wondering too, one of the other challenges I'm assuming that exists is that there's a lot of nighttime scenes in the film, a lot of scenes that are taking place after dark. I'm just curious about what the schedule was like, and how were you able to manage to get everything in that you needed to get in, especially that far north. The shooting season, I would imagine, was somewhat limited.
Right. I mean, it was a real roll of the dice, like shooting on location in, it was a real roll of the dice. And we were honestly, I think it's maybe because we did the smudge, that the spirits in the heavens were good to us. Wow. Because we had great weather. There was one day that we were supposed to shoot the boys on the war canoe on the lake. The weather was not cooperating, so we had to change the schedule for that. We did get a storm, but it was the morning that we were shooting a sequence from the First World War, so that fit. We did have some inclement weather, but I just kind of moved things around and shot Act 3 on that day where I thought that it could be raining instead of being sunny. Excuse me. It was really we were just blessed with really good weather. As far as the nighttime stuff, not all of the movie was shot on location. Parts of it were shot in a very large water tank in a sound studio. In a movie studio. So that was a more controlled environment with green screen and divers and lifeguards, and obviously there was a lot of safety concerns and safety issues that had to be considered. So it couldn't be you can't have actors in real freezing cold lake weather for a 11-hour shoot.
Right. Although, I mean, it'd be fun to tough it out.
Well,
right? It's pretty boy actors, right?
Yeah. And they wanted that. They wanted cold water. And they wanted, like, they're great. Like, they were all really rough and tumble, kind of like athletic guys, which is what we needed and what we were looking for when we were casting, certainly. But that being said, actors say a lot of things, and I think that they'd probably be able to stand it for like an hour, not 11 hours. And, they're also, protected by their agents and by their unions. And 3 or 4 of them were under the age of 18. So they were protected by their mothers, and that just wouldn't wash.
Right. And, but yeah, it turned out great. I said to you, before we started recording, when I watched it last night, within the first 2 minutes, I said to myself, this doesn't look like a Canadian movie. It really, it's, I'll just leave it at that, right? I think we all in our heads know what I mean when I say when things look Canadian.
Yeah.
This doesn't
You can
look
usually
Canadian.
sense it. Like, if you're flipping the channels, like, you can kind of tell right away. There's kind of like that, my DP, Adam Suika, and we used to kind of joke about kind of like the Canadian stink of something, which is, it sounds kind of self-hating and terrible for me to say that, but it's just, I mean, what can you say? It's just like, there is a Canadian look to certain things. I think when I talk to my cinematographer, he would usually say that Canadian film and television is usually overlit. So there's that. There's sometimes a feel of wooden, kind of like a Canadian wooden acting. Maybe it's a little bit theatrical. It might have more to do with the fact that, like, the Canadian actors are usually trained at theater schools, perhaps, or maybe that sort of kind of like old British kind of, theater, stagey. I don't know, like, even when you think about the early days of CBC, everything was very stagey. Maybe that's kind of like ended up in our DNA somewhere. That, for me, my favorite filmmaker, I would say my favorite movie of all time is Lawrence of Arabia, David Lean. Like, that was stuff that was not done on stages. That was, they had cameras melting in the desert. And I just think that, with filmmaking, it's just make it as real as possible, make it as authentic as possible. So I think that's probably why the movie ended up looking good, but it's also really a testament to my cinematographer, Adam Suika. He's 25 years older than me. He's like, got a very kind of like older Hollywood, maverick Hollywood kind of vibe. And he has a great eye, and he started, his career as a lighting guy. So he really understands light. And, I said to him, I want this to look like a mini epic, and I want it to look like an old Hollywood movie. And I think that he achieved that look in spades. It's also a testament to, the costume designer with, like, the Ginger Martini, like, and the production design and all that kind of stuff. I'm a big fan of detail, and I like details within details within details. And I think that there's things that you don't necessarily see in a movie, but they're certainly felt. I had the actors, their pockets were filled with useful things like playing cards and jacks and, like a little Swiss Army knife, marbles, bones, little curios. And every morning on set, they had to pick up the stuff that went in their pockets, from the props department. And so no one had a cell phone in their pocket when they were shooting this movie. And it's like, yeah, you could have a cell phone in your pocket, but for some reason, at the risk of sounding really mystical, I just feel like the audience can sense it or something.
Yeah, I think there's it's the Michael Richards theory. Like, when Kramer was carrying around an air conditioner in an episode that's in a box, he said put an air conditioner in the box. He didn't want to carry around an empty box. Like, there's just, even though you can't see the air conditioner, there's the struggle of picking something up. It's like when actors are drinking out of cups, but you can tell there's nothing in the cup. Right? It's just painfully obvious that there's nothing there. It really does, anything that takes you out of it for even a quarter of a second, you don't want.
Because those quarter of seconds, they add up.
Yeah.
They totally add up. And for me, like, we would present an actor with certain props and we would ask them to choose which one they wanted. Like, say for Arthur, like, he smokes a pipe. He was brought 2 pipes and it's like, choose the pipe that you like. And he chose the pipe that I didn't want for the character. And I was like, oh, that's not the one I want. Okay. And he went with the one that he wanted, you know, or even like there's some flashback sequences where you see, characters when they're younger or you see their relatives. And I would send those pictures to the actors and I would say, choose who you feel would be your mother, or choose who you feel looks like you when you were 10.
Right.
And I went with their decision because I feel like that kind of authenticity is palpable and, it's important.
Yeah. And if the actors have that stake in the character, again, that comes across in the performance.
Absolutely. Totally. Like the actor has to be completely invested in their character. And, you know, I made them do a lot of homework and, you know, we had a lot of bonding exercises and, you know, we all went to like not like a cabin, but sort of like a cottage in the woods, in an area called Mono. And, the boys brought, character bios that they had written, like 2-page character bios. And we went on a hike and we sat in a circle and we read each other, our character bios and, you know, they built a campfire. I also tasked all the actors with bringing an activity that they can teach to one another. So, like say Haig McGarry, who plays Gordon, he's kind of like the nerdy kid. He taught the actors how to build a rabbit trap, a rabbit snare. Right. And it was so delightful and engaging to watch. And he's kind of like screwing up by accident while he does it. And the actors are kind of like tittering and laughing at him. But that's like the character and that's like the relationship. You know, another actor, you know, did a magic trick. Another actor like taught like a lacrosse stick trick with a ball. Jake Manley actually taught the actors how to build like a proper fire. And I feel like that stuff just ends up in the soup. Like it really ends up in the movie. And for a film called Brotherhood, it's really vital that you feel that sense of camaraderie between the boys and that there is that spirit, like that esprit de corps amongst them.
Yeah, as you say, for a film of this type, where it's all about the relationships, that does need to be there. So again, the film is called Brotherhood. It is not. I don't know. We can't call it a premiere because it's already been shown, as you said, at Balsam Lake. But it's having a week-long run at the Cineplex at Yonge and Dundas in Toronto the week of December the 6th. Are we calling it a run? Like, what is?
Well, it's a theatrical premiere. So the screening on Balsam Lake that happened on July 20th, that was for the community and that was, you know, a sneak peek. Premieres, like when you say world premiere and all that kind of stuff, that's usually a term that's associated with film festivals. Right. So Cinefest Sudbury had the world premiere like in September. And then there was like one screening that happened in Haliburton, which felt very fitting because Haliburton is nestled between Algonquin Park and Coboconk, which is where the boys were headed that night. So we framed that screening for the community as, you know, for one weekend only, the boys reached the other side of the lake. There was also a screening at Queen's Park for invited military and veterans that was done on November 7th in concert with Remembrance Day. And that was hosted by the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Dowdeswell. So that was a bit of a sneak peek as well. This is the first theatrical run. I mean, I'd hoped that it'd show for longer than a week, but, you know, it's, you know, in the world of Canadian film, you sort of like hope for the best. If people, you know, if a lot of people come in droves that first weekend, hopefully it'll, you know, stay for a second week.
Yeah, so everyone in Toronto, in the Toronto area, head downtown the week of December the 6th, see Brotherhood, Yonge Dundas Square. There's tons of stuff. You know, you go for dinner before. There's like a million restaurants there. Just you can go see it. It's a great film, and it's you think it looks like it's going to be showing the week after in Sudbury too.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the theater, but it was the audiences in Sudbury like were really great, and we had at Cinefest we had a terrible screening time. Excuse me, sorry about that. It was a Monday at 4:00, but the interest was so great that it spilled over into 2 theaters. So like it was in theater 11, but it spilled over into 12 and 10 or something. So I'm really delighted by that.
Yes.
I think another reason to see Brotherhood on December 6th is because I know that what the weather is like in Toronto right now. And if you want to warm up a bit and see a movie about the halcyon days of summer, I think that Brotherhood is the way to go.
Yeah, it reminds you of life at the lake, walking on the sand, going swimming. Just it
Absolutely
gives you a sense of warmth in not a warm time of year.
Exactly.
So definitely do check it out. The theatrical premiere December 6th. Again, the Cineplex at Yonge and Dundas, and then for all our friends at Laurentian University in the Sudbury area, the following week of the 13th, December 13th, up there in Sudbury.
I looked up the name of the theater in Sudbury. It's called Sudbury Indie Cinema.
Okay, the Indie Cinema in Sudbury. So definitely check that out, and hopefully it gets good response in these 2 cities, and that will allow the film to go national for a big national theatrical release. Because as I said, I enjoyed it, and I think anyone who listens to this podcast enjoys historical content will enjoy the film as well. So definitely check it out if you're in the GTA or in Sudbury. And my thanks to Richard Bell for taking the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our talk.
If you have any questions or comments for the show, you can find us at historyslam@gmail.com. I am at Dr. Shawnee Fever on Twitter. If you have not yet, please do subscribe to the show on Google Play, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your show. Give us the likes, ratings, all that fun stuff to keep the show going. And we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode. But until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.